Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, independent candidate on the LaRouche line for U.S. Senate in New York. And today is Friday, September 13th. I do want to let people know that this is being pre-recorded in the morning. So if the world has dramatically changed by the time we see this or this is aired, that's why. Now, we are in an unbelievable strategic situation. And as people may know, my T-shirt has the slogan on the back, which is nuclear power, not nuclear war. There's a great difference between the two. Like anything that human beings discover, new technologies, scientific knowledge can be used either for the good of mankind or in some cases for enormous destruction. The more powerful our discoveries, the greater the potential in both directions, which is why one of the major aspects of my campaign is to fight for an elevated and noble culture which upholds the dignity of man, because if we have such a culture, then that is the best way to guarantee that exciting scientific discoveries will be used for the common good and not destruction. But on the destruction front, I just want to share with you some extremely important comments made by the Russian President Vladimir Putin in response to a visit by the British and UK foreign ministers to Kiev. I also would like to remind people that in 2019, the British House of Lords put out a report saying that they considered the re-election of Donald Trump to the White House an absolute mortal threat, the worst thing that could possibly happen to the UK-US quote unquote special relationship. Now, I thought we had a revolution against the British, and if their elites decide to no longer be an empire, if they'll deflate the City of London financial markets and relegate the monarchy to truly a ceremonial position and not a position where they have the final say in everything, maybe we could have a special relationship with them. But until they renounce their colonial legacy, the United States should come back to its senses and realize that we had a revolution against colonialism, not so that we could become the new colonial enforcer on the planet. So as I said, Tony Blinken and the British Defense Secretary Lammy, who I think should be renamed Wolfie, were in Kiev. And here is Putin's response to the London Guardian's leaking that it is likely that they gave Kiev, quote unquote, permission to use long-range missiles to strike deep inside Russia. And this should be taken very seriously, and it is not being covered in the American press. So Putin's response to this is to say, what we are seeing is an attempt to substitute notions, because this is not a question of whether the Kiev regime is allowed or is not allowed to strike targets on Russian territory. It is already carrying out strikes using unmanned aerial vehicles and other means. But using Western-made long-range precision weapons is a completely different story. The fact is that I have mentioned this, and any expert both in our country and in the West will confirm this. The Ukrainian army is not capable of using cutting-edge, high-precision, long-range systems supplied by the West. They cannot do that. These weapons are impossible to employ without intelligence and data from satellites, which Ukraine does not have. This can only be done using the European Union's satellites or US satellites, in general, NATO satellites. This is the first point. The second point, perhaps the most important, the key point even, is that only NATO military personnel can assign flight missions to these missile systems. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this. Therefore, it is not a question of allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is about deciding whether NATO countries, become directly involved in the military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. I want that to sink in. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean their direct involvement in the conflict, and it will clearly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict dramatically. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us. So that is what the Russian president has had to say about the latest conspiring of the British and American foreign ministers. They are not telling anyone publicly, officially, what they discussed. This is obviously extremely significant, extremely dangerous, and completely unnecessary. It is absolutely possible to find a negotiated end to this war, as it would be possible to secure a ceasefire, release of the hostages, and an end to the mass murderous Israeli assault on Gaza and now on the West Bank. There simply is not the will to do that. Now, what we're going to be discussing today is the peaceful use of nuclear technology, the nuclear discovery, something which gets at something human beings really cannot live without, which I also wish people might consider more carefully, which is energy. If just reflect on everything that you do in a day and whether or not you use electricity when you do it, or other forms of power like driving your car, or just about anything that you can think of that you take for granted, and what would be the impact of not having any energy. People who lived through Sandy in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area can remember days and weeks without power and the various hardships entailed. But imagine an entire nation without electricity, and you think of situations like Haiti, where people, 80% of their energy comes from burning charcoal, which is extremely destructive to the environment and to the health of the people involved. So of late, even though the state of New York was foolish enough to shut down Indian Point, it seems to be dawning on some people, including the governor, that perhaps we better make sure, if we want to have any industry or a decent standard of living, that we have adequate energy. And if you're talking about eliminating fossil fuels, which is not something that I am calling for, let me be very clear, and my speaker and I may have certain disagreements on this point, but if you really want to have zero emissions, you are simply not going to do it with solar and wind. Nuclear power absolutely has to be part of the package. Nuclear power has to be part of the package anyway, because mankind cannot advance unless we have denser and more powerful forms of energy, which also use smaller and smaller amounts of fuel, which is the beauty of this process. So there was a recent energy summit. The state of New York is now talking about nuclear power being part of the mix. I have a guest on today who's been involved in presenting testimony at various of these hearings and discussions throughout the state. He is an electrical engineer who also worked with the Nuclear New York, the New York Energy and Climate Advocates as a volunteer, the Nature Conservancy. His name is Keith Schue, and as always, I will say that my guests are here for the purpose of educating the electorate, This does not constitute endorsement of mine or any political candidacy, and we may or may not agree or disagree on many matters. The views expressed are the views of the people who express them. So with that, Keith, welcome. I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So, yeah, I just want to, emphasize what you just said, which is that Nuclear New York, as well as New York Energy Climate Advocates, these are organizations that are nonpartisan. We have members that are involved with our groups that range on all sides of the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right to the middle. I consider myself in the middle. Yeah, so our concern here is where we're going in terms of energy, and how can we meet the needs of human beings while protecting the environment at the same time. And I think that's something that you and I share common agreement on. So yeah, there's a presentation I'd like to give. I think there's a really perhaps a good video that could be shared to kick this off from Eric Dawson, who spoke at a press conference prior to the September 5th summit.
New York's CLCPA, one of the strictest climate laws in the U.S., was passed in 2019 primarily with the goal of lowering carbon emissions. Now, 5 years later, carbon emissions are actually higher. In the last 2 decades, fossil fuel use was never lower in New York State than in 2019, when both of Indian Point nuclear power plant's reactors were still online. There's a lesson to be learned here. Since the shutdown of the last nuclear power plant operational downstate, we have higher carbon emissions, higher electricity prices, and a higher chance of power outages throughout the state. Previously, NYSO, one of the major organizations in New York, our independent system operator, has described this with a kind of highbrow Dickensian phrase: instead of a tale of two cities, a tale of two grids. We all know that upstate and downstate have these economic, cultural, political divides, and upstate maybe they don't care as much about climate change as downstate. Nonetheless, in upstate New York, they have a 90% clean grid with 3 operational nuclear power plants. Meanwhile, downstate New York now has a 90% fossil fuel grid after shutting down all their nuclear power plants. So there's a clear moral to be learned here. Again, the primary goal of the CLCPA is 100% zero-emission electricity by 2040, but the specific type of zero-emission electricity does not matter. We should just use what works. And so we feel that New York's climate policy is overestimating the capabilities of renewables like solar and wind, while underestimating the need for nuclear, especially new nuclear. So if you care about the rapid electrification of vehicles, of buildings, of heavy machinery, if you care about smartphones and tablets and smartwatches, if you care about the rise of data centers and cryptocurrency and AI, or if you care about desalination plants or hydrogen electrolyzers or hydrogen fuel cells or carbon capture tech, all of this has one thing in common: it requires a huge growing supply of zero-emission electricity on a grid. And there is just one candidate capable of scaling up to the level that we need today. Very simply, nuclear is the most reliable source of zero-emission energy, and it requires the least land, the least materials, the least new transmission lines, the least backup, and the least reliance on foreign supply chains of any other zero-emission source. And really, it's a bipartisan issue at the national level. Democrats are pro-nuclear now, Republicans are pro-nuclear. It should be a nonpartisan issue. We should just use what works, and nuclear energy works. If you want to find out more, we are Nuclear New York. You can find us at nuclearny.org, or come to our conference later this month in New York City on September 25th. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that really kind of puts in context what we're talking about here. And one of the other things Eric spoke about at the end there was a conference that Nuclear New York is putting together, along with many other groups and organizations in New York City. That's going to be happening on September 25th. It's the 2024 Nuclear Symposium that is titled Uplifting Humanity. So aside from climate change and other reasons that we might want to consider nuclear, the sheer ability for nuclear power to provide that abundant source of energy that humanity is going to need going forward, that's going to be a big topic. And we're bringing in global leaders from all over to talk about it. So I'll tell you more about that in a little while too. I guess before I give the presentation, I'd like to kind of share with you. There's another video that I think is relevant. It's testimony from me back in 2022 when the Climate Action Council for New York was considering comments from the public on the scoping plan, which has been adopted. It was adopted in December 2022, and it started the process of what we're dealing with right now. So maybe that could be played.
Mm-hmm.
Advisor, New York. Keith Schue, Technical Advisor, New York Energy and Climate Advocates.
Thank you very much. I support renewables. I support environmental justice. You ought to be able to figure out how to heat and cool this building without burning fossil fuels in Sheridan Hollow, so please do that. However, I'm here to talk about the big picture. How will we make all of the carbon-free electricity that our state needs, especially when beneficial electrification doubles demand? Electricity is supposed to be the easy part. But unfortunately, your plan takes a Rube Goldberg approach that will actually make decarbonizing our grid as difficult as possible. Your plan calls for hundreds of square miles of solar, thousands of wind turbines onshore and offshore, massive batteries, 400 miles of hydrogen-grade pipeline, and fuel cells adding up to as much capacity as all the gas plants in the state. You have overestimated capacity factors and you have underestimated the challenges of intermittency, transmission, and storage. That is putting New York on the same path as California, a state that has thrown massive amounts of money into renewables but remains shackled to fossil fuels. Big wind and solar profit, the fossil fuel industry profits, but people and the planet continue to suffer. Look, I don't want to see this become the Climate Failure and Community Destruction Act. I want the CLCPA to succeed, but that means we need renewables and we need nuclear power. NYSERDA's integration analysis assumes the relicensing of our upstate plants for 20 years, you know? That's good, but if you don't want to still be burning fossil fuels for electricity in 2040 and beyond, then we also need to plan for advanced nuclear deployed a decade or so from now. I'm an engineer, but I came to support nuclear power as an environmentalist, as a tree hugger. Nuclear has the smallest physical footprint and the smallest material requirements of any carbon-free source. That means you get to protect farmland and nature. Nuclear power means abundant energy, and with abundant energy comes the ability to do abundant good for humanity. I say let's do abundant good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Keith Schue, Technical
All right,
Advisor.
hold on. There we go.
Hey. So yeah, that was 2022. You could tell that as I was testifying, the speed of my talking accelerated because I was seeing the clock reach that 2-minute clock at that time period. We had exactly 120 seconds, and then we were done. So that's why that happened. But anyway, yeah, I think
You got
think
in
that,
a lot. I have to say, you got in a lot. That was very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it was fun. But so so here we are. It's been a couple years since that happened. And some of the things I warned about, some of the things that Eric talked about, we're facing in terms of the reality factors, the difficulties of implementing a plan that's predominantly based on intermittent technology, solar and wind. So anyway, I'd like to share a presentation with you that I put together that gets into some of this stuff in more detail. Let me see if I can do this correctly. I'm doing a share screen. I'm trying to do a share screen. Okay, let me know.
Good.
Okay, I'm trying to get to the slideshow. There you go. Okay, are you seeing full screen or close to full screen there?
Yeah.
Okay, so Yeah, just I think as an overview of what the Climate Act is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, passed in 2019, signed into law by then Governor Andrew Cuomo. It had several goals associated with it. So 2019, this was a picture of our electricity portfolio. You can see the composition here. We had about 39% fossil fuels. We actually had most of it, the majority of it, clean energy in terms of hydro, a little bit of wind, a little bit of solar, and a lot of nuclear power. So we'll talk about how that picture's changed. But let's talk about the goals of the CLCPA. Okay, that's 2019. By 2030, the CLCPA says that we're supposed to have 70% renewables. So that dark shaded green is supposed to swell up to 70%. And for 2030, there's no requirement as to what the rest needs to be. So by the year 2040, we're supposed to have 100% carbon-free electricity. So that broadens the possibilities there to include other carbon-free sources of electricity like nuclear power. But the goal there is to get 100% carbon-free electricity, not things that produce carbon emissions in the process of making electricity. By 2050, we're supposed to have an 85% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions. So that's not just electricity, but that's everything else. Our vehicles, our industry, other things that produce carbon emissions, we're supposed to bring all of the carbon emissions down by 85% by the year 2050. And from an electricity standpoint, you can see this pie, the pie charts I'm showing here, they're getting bigger. 2040, 2050, those are, why is the pie bigger? Well, it's bigger because if we're going to decarbonize our other sectors, that means electrifying those things, whether it's heat pumps in homes instead of furnaces, or whether it's electric vehicles instead of internal combustion vehicles, and then industry. And then we're also seeing the emergence of more energy demand for other reasons too. AI, data centers, things like that. So we're going to need a lot more electricity in the future as well. That's why the pie gets bigger. So that's what the CLCPA called for in the legislation. So when the act passed, there was a whole lot of celebration, a lot of fanfare. Some of the people in this picture aren't around anymore, but this is what. There was a lot of celebration at the time. They appointed a Climate Action Council. That Climate Action Council put together a scoping plan. That was the scoping plan that I testified on that you saw a minute ago. And the interesting thing is that they declared we're going to get there. We're going to meet our goals this way. With wind, water, and sunlight will power most of New York's economy in 2050. So, like I said, the goal is carbon-free electricity. But now we're going to make technology-specific edicts here that wind, water, and sunlight's going to do most of it. So this is where concerns arise. As an engineer, I have concerns about how something like that happens. Anyway, again, a lot of fanfare when this went forward, a lot of celebration by certain interests, not by everybody. What you're seeing right now is a huge uprising, frankly, of folks around the state who aren't too thrilled by this. They're seeing the imposition of large-scale wind and solar projects all around them, and it's affecting upstate New York in particular. And what are they concerned about? Well, they're concerned about this. This is what I call energy sprawl. In my past, I was quite involved with some mainstream environmental organizations fighting what we called urban sprawl or suburban sprawl. But if those things are bad, then isn't this doing some harm ecologically as well? I think it is. And so folks are concerned about this. They want to protect their way of life. They want to protect nature. And these things are potentially under threat depending on how much these type of solutions are pursued. And I think folks are also very concerned about how the state is going about it. There was the creation of an Office of Renewable Energy Siting that happened shortly after passage of the CLCPA. Basically, it streamlined the whole review process. Very some call it a rubber stamp type of review of projects, very large projects, a 1 year time frame where the things get automatically approved. That's been put on steroids with the Rapid Act, which was passed recently, that would actually give ORES, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, jurisdiction also over the approval of large scale transmission to site these things. And would also, invoke the potential for eminent domain to build these transmission facilities. So that's something that concerns folks. Another thing of concern is that some gifts were given recently to the wind and solar industry. In terms of tax breaks, an appraisal process was instilled at the state level, mandated that local governments implement a particular appraisal process that basically devalued the amount of taxes that these facilities would have to pay into local coffers would be reduced like up to 80%. So that has a direct impact on schools, fire, fire fighting and other local needs. So again, people are concerned, local communities are concerned. What else are they concerned about? Well, I mean, the reality is that if you look at the grid, like Eric called it, a tale of two grids, we got upstate and downstate. Upstate, if you look at our grid, it's already mostly decarbonized. And it's been that way for quite a while with nuclear power and hydropower. Those are the two big workhorses that provide reliable carbon-free electricity. Meanwhile, downstate, they're the ones with the problem. They're the ones that are burning fossil fuels, and they made their situation worse, as we'll talk about too, recently with the closure of Indian Point. So, upstate folks are having to shoulder the burden for solving a problem that's basically not their problem. It's something that's a downstate problem that's gotten worse because of decisions that have been made downstate. So, there's a reality factor there. And another thing, when the CLCPA was first put forward and the scoping plan was put forward, it wasn't just communities that were concerned. Labor was concerned. Labor was concerned because they could see that the good jobs are not going to be unpacking solar panels made in China. The good jobs are solid jobs. Whether it's high tech, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or whether it's nuclear industry, that's where the good jobs were, and they could see the writing on the wall of what could be happening here with their good solid union jobs being displaced. So they had great concerns as well. So let's look at the plan. Let's look at the plan that's been put forward. What you're seeing here is a chart. 2020 on the left up to 2050, and you can see the tremendous escalation of capacity of resources that have to be brought to bear in order to decrease our carbon emissions by getting us off of fossil fuels. So why is it so big? Why the massive ramp up? Well, part of it is because of the electrification of things. We need more electricity to start with, but a large part of this is not that. A large part of that is because of the particular sources of energy that are being selected here. We're talking about sources of energy, solar and wind, that have what we call very low capacity factor. Okay. Capacity factor is a measure of how much actual electricity you're getting out of a source over a period of time, like a year, compared to what it could produce. Let's say the sun was out all the time and you had sunshine all the time, you'd have 100% capacity factor from a solar panel. That's not reality. It gets dark at night, and sometimes it's raining, sometimes it's snowing, and you don't have production there. The average capacity factor, DC capacity factor for solar is about 14% at the latitude we're in. Wind is a little bit better. These are numbers from NISO, I should tell you. But then you have hydropower, which is a much higher capacity factor, and nuclear power, which rules in terms of capacity factor. You can run it almost all the time, 95% capacity factor or upwards of that. So this is the issue. We're selecting sources, wind and solar predominantly, that have very low capacity factors, so you need just a lot more of it to make the energy that you need. And you're not getting the electricity when you need it. You're getting it when the weather cooperates, or the time of day cooperates, and that means you've got to move the energy that you're getting from when you're getting it to when you actually need it. So you need batteries, you need storage. That's what you're seeing illustrated here, having to ramp up as well. Beyond that, there's going to be times when you don't have the sun, you don't have the wind, your batteries are depleted, and you have to have some other reliable form of carbon-free electricity to back it all up. That's the orange bar here. And if you look at the shape of this here, even if you don't need to rely on those firm, dispatchable, emission-free resources, even if you don't have to rely on them as much as fossil fuels, you still have to build all of it. So in terms of capacity, there's a lot of stuff you have to build. A tremendous amount of things that have to be installed, built, and put together to make a plan like this, to try to make a plan like this work. So let's break it down a little bit. So that's solar. All right. We're competing with Alaska. For in Washington State for being like the worst place to do solar. This is how much solar energy you get from different places in the country. You get a lot of solar down in Arizona, not so much up here. Same kind of thing applies with wind. We have some wind resources in upstate New York, but they follow the ridge lines. It's not constant. It's not like the Great Plains out west or Midwest where you have tremendous wind resources. So that's a factor as well. Let's talk about the different numbers here. If you do the math on this, you calculate what NYSERDA was predicting, how much solar you need, how much wind you need, how much everything else you need. Just solar. Let's just talk about solar. You need about, doing the math on it, about 400 to 600 square miles of solar that would have to be built between now and 2050. Break that down on a yearly basis. It's about 22 square miles. 22 square miles of land, that would be lost. Whatever it is today, farmland or forest, 22 square miles every year would have to be converted from that to glass, copper, and steel. That's an area about the size of Albany. So imagine an area the size of Albany being wiped out every single year, a new area that size being wiped out every single year in order to just install the solar component. Does that seem realistic? Does that seem environmental to you? Let's talk about wind. You need upwards about 2,000 or so wind turbines installed. Break it down, it's about a new wind turbine every 5 days. These aren't small things. These are large facilities. 650 feet tall is the height of these 5 megawatt facilities that are being built. A lot of folks don't like this potentially happening. How about offshore wind? You may have heard about what's happened at Nantucket, where these things can break and fall into the ocean and wash up on shore, and this is a concern. So we're talking about over 1,000 wind turbines offshore that would have to be built. These are the big ones, the 15 megawatt size ones. About a wind turbine every single week would have to be built, again, for the next 26 years. Transmission. Well, they say that that if we're going to electrify everything, you're going to need about twice as much transmission. And if you're going to try to build a grid that's dominated by wind and solar, large-scale intermittent sources that are scattered around, then you're going to have to probably quadruple the amount of transmission that we need across the landscape. How about storage? Well, the largest battery plant in the world is in Moss Landing, California. According to NYSERDA's analysis that they put forward in the scoping plan, you need about 100 of these things just for New York to do the storage component. And then, like I said, even if you do that, even if you do all that, there are going to be times when you don't have wind, you don't have sun, and your batteries are depleted. You're looking at that in the graph here. The red areas in the chart kind of show where the wind, which is green, and the yellow, which is solar. You can charge some of that at times of when those things exceed existing demand, but then you have to discharge them, and they deplete pretty quickly, even if you install a lot of it, even if you install as much as I just mentioned. And so you have these gaps, especially gaps in the wintertime when you don't have when you don't have anything. Except for your baseload generators, which are at the bottom there, hydro and nuclear. So that means you have a lot to make up for. What are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? What's that dispatchable emission-free resource? Well, that's a big topic right now. The scoping plan looked at hydrogen, and I think there actually is a certain role for hydrogen in the future. But the idea that we could have to build this much hydrogen capacity to back everything up, that I think is unrealistic. And also, even if you look at the fine print of the scoping plan, they were talking about having to install like 400 miles of hydrogen grade pipeline to make that work as well. So, folks who thought we were going to get rid of gas pipelines, well, you're going to have giant hydrogen grade pipelines potentially. These are thicker pipelines to be able to carry the hydrogen and so forth. So, impacts associated with that as well. And how much of that backup electricity would you need? Like I said before, you need about as much capacity as what your dispatchable fossil fuels were to start with. So you have to build equivalent capacity just as backup to what you had from the fossil fuel arena. So anyway, if this is starting to kind of look like a Rube Goldberg picture, this the cartoonist who put these funny pictures together. You take a relatively straightforward problem and then you try to solve it in the most complicated, convoluted way you possibly can. If that's kind of seems like what's happening here, I would agree with you. So, bottom line is, there's a couple basic limiting factors in what we're talking about here. When we're talking about a grid that you're trying to build predominantly with intermittent sources, you have energy density. You just need a whole lot of the stuff, a lot of wind and solar to make a relatively small lot of electricity. And then intermittency, you're not getting electricity when you need it. You get it when the weather cooperates. Electricity is a just-in-time commodity, but demand is something that's there precisely. You have to answer that demand when it's there. So that's the conundrum. And this is what happens. People will tell you, oh, well, wind and solar are cheap. Look at the prices that are coming down. Okay, well, that's true. But so we're here. When you look at trying to put more and more intermittent sources on the grid, you're having to add lots of storage and then even more storage the more you try to climb this asymptotic curve. And the challenges of storage and transmission become phenomenal, and you never really get there. So you're climbing a curve. The system level costs is what kills you. And so you hear advocates of wind and solar talking about levelized cost of electricity. That's just looking at the unit cost of electricity for a particular source to make electricity when it's making it. You can't look at that. You can't look at just that. You have to look at the system level impacts. That's what really matters. And so, this is a chart. Everything I showed you was from the NYSERDA's estimate. Now, there's been a lot of analysis that's come in since then, including from the New York Independent System Operator, indicating that those were underestimates, that if you really were trying to do this with predominantly intermittent sources, it would be even harder than everything I just showed you that NYSERDA predicted. In fact, NYSO was saying you would need more of all those things, the wind, the solar, the storage, the backup generation. You need more of all of that by 2040 than NYSERDA thinks you need by 2050. So there's some real disparity here. On the facts, and I won't get into all the issues of why that is. We can get into that perhaps later. But so NYSERDA underestimated the problem. And so what happens when you do that? When you underestimate the problems, when you kind of have rose-colored glasses onto the reality factors here, well, you fail. And you can kind of see what failure looks like. We have some evidence of that already. Look at California. California has spent billions of dollars on wind and solar. They also made the mistake of shutting down, some of their nuclear. And so what have they done? Well, you can see over time how things have progressed. Fossil fuel use has gone up and down, but it really hasn't changed that much overall. They're still burning about as much fossil fuels, as much gas as they did 20 years ago. And now they don't have reliable electricity. They get blackouts at times. So they're having to import a lot of their electricity to attempt to create a reliable grid. They're having to import dirty electricity from coal from other states, and their price of electricity is like almost twice the national average. So that's California. Let's look at another place. Let's look at Germany. So Germany had a program that they were very proud of called Energiewende. Basically means the energy way, and so their goal was to shut down nuclear and to instead build lots of wind and solar. And And they actually are building a lot of biomass too, which is not a good answer ecologically or from any standpoint. However, they call that renewable. So here's Germany. This is a picture of the grid of Europe. And what you're seeing is the carbon intensity. The greener the color is, the cleaner the electricity. The less carbon intensity associated with it. The darker the color, the browner, the dark brown, that's the dirtier grids. So that's Germany right there. So after spending decades on wind and solar, they still have a pretty dirty grid. Let's look at the tale of two countries here. Let's look at France just nearby. Well, they're mostly green. And why is that? Well, they have carbon-free nuclear power. They've had it for decades. They weren't even trying to deal with climate change at the time. They were just trying to get reliable electricity, which is what they have. And they also have now some of the cleanest air in Europe. So I think that tells you, that says it all right there. And by the way, France also exports a lot of electricity to Germany to bail out the electric grid in Germany. So you don't have to look across the ocean or across the country either to see what failure looks like. You can look right here in New York. This is what happened when New York shut down Indian Point. Okay, that's something Diane talked about, and you can see, there were folks predicting, oh, well, this is going to be replaced by renewables. It'll happen real quick. That didn't happen. What happened is fossil fuels made up the difference. Yeah, there was some increases in wind and solar, but predominantly fossil fuels was what made up the difference, and as well as imported electricity. We've had to import more electricity. And what does that translate to on the ground? It means that the state actually had to build more fossil fuel power plants. CPV and Cricket Valley are two giant gas-fired power plants that were built right about the time when they closed Indian Point in order to make up for the electricity loss from Indian Point. And then other power plants, fossil fuel power plants in the greater metropolitan area of New York City have also had to burn fossil fuels more than they did before. And so a lot of folks are concerned about peaker plants. We've had to run peaker plants more actually to help make up for that difference in the loss of carbon-free electricity from Indian Point. So that's a shame. One of the focuses of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was supposed to be environmental justice, the impacts of historically impacted communities from fossil fuel use. Well, I mean, I think you can clearly call these things environmental injustice zones, because as a result of closing Indian Point, the air that people are breathing downstate is dirtier, with more emissions from fossil fuel power plants. It's quite ironic, and so carbon emissions, we're on the decline. They started to go up. The price of electricity went up as well, and ISO attributed that in part to the closure of Indian Point. There are about 10 to 15 million tons of avoidable greenhouse gas emissions coming from our energy grid right now, from fossil fuels that wouldn't have to be if we had just left Indian Point open. By shutting down just one of Indian Point's two reactors, New York lost more carbon-free electricity than every wind turbine and solar panel added up in the whole state at that time. But then we actually closed two of them, which made it twice as bad. So this is the result. I showed you the graph already on the chart on the left already, 2019. This is 2023. We've gone backwards. We've gone backwards in terms of the carbon content of our electrical grid. And that happened because, we lost nuclear power. So just for kicks, let's look at how much electricity, how much solar you would need. Say you wanted to replace Indian Point with solar. What would it take? Well, okay, Indian Point occupied about 240 acres. If you were trying to do that with solar, guess what? You need about 60,000 acres, and you wouldn't be getting useful electricity. You would be getting electricity, giant amounts in the summertime, in the daytime, and not on a continual basis, which is what we need. What if you did try to replace Indian Point with wind? How many of these giant 650-foot tall facilities would have to be built? How about like over 1,700? 1,300 wind turbines. And this is assuming a really optimistic capacity factor of 29% for all of them, which is really way more than I think we could expect. So we're talking about more than this in terms of the total amount of wind to replace Indian Point. So when folks upstate are upset about these large facilities happening in their backyard, they know who to blame. The first 60,000 acres of solar panels was this downstate folks who insisted on shutting down Indian Point. Anyhow, is there a better way? Is there a way that would actually work in the real world? Yeah, there is. And I think we know what that is. It helps to look at what the goal is. Well, the goal is we're trying to meet real-time demand. This is a graph that shows you demand over the course of a year. It fluctuates. It goes up and down on a daily basis. It goes up and down on a seasonal basis. However, there's a certain amount of demand that's always there. It's called baseload demand. So if you have a source of electricity that can give you electricity, that can give you energy all of the time, provide that baseload energy, why don't use that instead of trying to stack up a bunch of intermittent sources? If you have electricity that is giving you electricity when you actually need it, so you don't need storage, then why don't you do that? Or if you have a source of electricity that's already reliable, so then you don't need backup generation because you're already using a reliable source, and why don't we do that? Well, that's what system level efficiency is. It's the optimal use of generation capacity. So instead of just firm backup capacity, let's use a firm source of electricity as the backbone of an efficient decarbonized grid. And if you look at what's happened around the world, places that actually have successfully decarbonized their grids, how do they do it? They did it with two things predominantly: reliable baseload hydropower and reliable baseload nuclear power. We are fortunate in New York to have a good source of hydropower. Okay, we've got Niagara, we've got St. Lawrence plants. These are big facilities. They make a lot of electricity, but they're kind of tapped out. There might be some room for hydropower expansion in New York. In fact, I think there's a little bit, and I think we should pursue that where possible. But we're largely tapped out. So what does that mean? If you want another reliable source of energy, okay, that's nuclear power. And we have these workhorses upstate, the Fitzpatrick plant, 9 Mile plant, the Ginna plant. These things have been producing electricity for decades. They have licenses. They have a relicensing program that they have to go through. And so that's coming up. If we're smart, we're going to renew those licenses. And if we're dumb, we won't. But what if we really want to do, if we want to meet our energy needs in the future with a realistic approach, we don't need to just relicense these plants. Because let me tell you something, everything I showed you about the NYSERDA plan, even NYSERDA was assuming these plants would be relicensed. Okay, so that should be a no-brainer. But aside from that, if we really want to solve this problem, dramatically reduce fossil fuel use, dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then we shouldn't be just relicensing plants. We should be building more nuclear plants. And that's where the good news is, because there are a lot of great technologies on the horizon coming up that are being built. Westinghouse already has one in Georgia that was built recently, and Natrium reactor in Wyoming. That's Bill Gates' project. That has additional flexibility associated with it, with thermal storage. There's some great designs out there. And this is something that if we're serious about decarbonizing, needs to be part of the future. I think all of us on this communication agree with that. This guy agrees with that too. His name is Dr. James Hansen. I had the privilege of meeting him on a few occasions. He is the guy who talked about climate change back in the 1980s. This was him testifying in Congress about climate change. This is him testifying in 2022 in the corner here to the Climate Action Council, and he told them, you got this all wrong. If you're serious about this issue, you don't want to be the Germany of the United States. We need more nuclear power. So this is what the left picture here shows you what NYSERDA's plan was. If you just do a back of the envelope type of calculation, you can kind of estimate, say we actually build some wind and solar, because that's what's available right now. But then in the 2030 timeframe, when the small modular reactors and other reactor technologies are available, let's start building that. If we did that instead of solar, you can see how the picture becomes more moderate, becomes more reasonable, more doable. And you know, I've criticized NYSERDA a lot too, but I will say after taking all the public comments that they took, they did add an appendix to their scoping plan that acknowledged that if we increased, for example, nuclear power, add 4 gigawatts, that's about the size of 2 Indian points. If we did that, we could reduce the amount of intermittent generation by 12 gigawatts. We could reduce the amount of backup generation, storage, and all that by another 5 gigawatts. So it's significant. And actually, NYSERDA admitted this even a couple of years ago. So nuclear, I'll try to go through this quickly. I think a lot of you are aware of this already. Why would you do nuclear? A lot of people are concerned about it. Well, it actually has the lowest life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, not just when you're when you're making electricity, but if you're looking at mining things, having to build the facilities, all those doing all those activities and carbon footprints, whether it's a fossil fuel plant, a nuclear plant, hydro or solar. Actually, nuclear has the smallest life cycle greenhouse gas footprint of any energy source. In terms of land, we already talked about that. It's just a tremendous savings on land if we go with nuclear instead of intermittent wind and solar. And this is a chart that bears that out. Material, everything to make anything, to make a source of energy, you have to mine materials, right? So people talk about the mining of coal and the drilling of oil and the potential mining of uranium. But what about everything else that goes into building these facilities? When you look at the actual content, the nuts and bolts, I could show you another graph with rare earth metals, but just the nuts and bolts here, the steel, cement, aluminum, copper, these type of things. How much goes into building different sources of energy? What you see is nuclear actually has the smallest material footprint in terms of content of any energy source because it's so energy dense. So people say, okay, well, Keith, you forgot about something. You forgot about the fuel. Nuclear power requires uranium. That's the fuel. You have to mine that, right? Okay, let's put fuel into this equation. When you put fuel into this equation, that swamps things out. Okay, coal, gas, lots of fuel that have to be retrieved from the ground for that. That swamps things out. That's the red bar that you're seeing down there on the bottom. Nuclear has a red bar too for fuel, but it's so small you can't see it in the picture. That's how little uranium mining has to occur to make a whole lot of energy. And I mean, it's phenomenal, actually. One uranium pellet about the size of a gummy bear has as much energy content as a ton of coal. It's quite amazing. And so what does that mean? If you have a source of energy that has a low material footprint, has a low land footprint, you get to do what? You get to protect this farmland and nature, and that's my real reason for supporting nuclear power. And you know, there are numbers that bear this out too. Some folks are concerned about safety. You know, you've heard stuff about some accidents that have occurred in the past. Even when you factor those things in, you find that nuclear is as safe as renewables. When you look at terawatt hours, deaths per terawatt hour is not a pleasant statistic to talk about. But when you look at that, you look at worker accidents, air pollution related deaths associated with different forms of energy, nuclear is really among the cleanest. And that's when you even count things like Chernobyl, which arguably I would say you don't have to count because we don't build reactors like that here. But anyhow, even if you do, that's what you're seeing. 8 million people die annually, premature deaths due to fossil fuel emissions. Okay, the storage of spent nuclear fuel hasn't harmed anyone in the history of nuclear power. All of the spent nuclear fuel ever produced from all the commercial nuclear power plants in the United States could fit into a single Walmart. All right, it's pretty phenomenal. And when nuclear power has been lost, wherever it's been replaced by fossil fuels. That's just a fact. Nuclear has some of the highest wages. I won't go through the numbers here, but high union wages. That makes it very attractive to labor. And around the world, you know, humanity's relooking at nuclear. France is reinvesting in nuclear. Netherlands, United Kingdom, Westinghouse is going to be installing some large AP1000s in Poland, I believe. a lot's happening. And here in the United States, I mean, states that had been banning nuclear, they're now lifting those bans, and plants are being saved that were going to be shut down. Indian Point was a mistake. They did not make that mistake in Illinois. They did not make that mistake recently in California. California, of all places, decided to keep their Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant running. So some times are changing here. And then there's great stuff happening on the horizon with new technologies, which I already mentioned. And even most recently, this Oracle, I just read about this a couple of days ago. They're looking at designing a data center that could be powered by 3 small reactors, a whole gigawatt of electricity for a data center. Can you imagine that? Nuclear is dispatchable. It's a clean power. We want to bring more of it on. That's what was said by U.S. Secretary Energy Jennifer Grant. U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm recently. Last year, I saw this guy, John Kerry, talking at a summit on nuclear, and they launched a program called Net Zero Nuclear, trying to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. If you look at John Kerry's past, he was against nuclear strongly in the past, but he's coming around and saying, yeah, we need it. If we're serious about climate, if we're serious about meeting energy needs, we need it. And that bears it out in the statistics too. Nuclear is increasing in popularity, increasing in public support, including among Democrats. So what about New York? This gets to where we are today. So everything has kind of hit the fan recently, right? So NYSERDA, in its biannual review, they basically said, that's 2030 goal. We're not going to make it. We can't really make it. I mean, this is where we were. Look at add it up. 21 and wind and solar adds up to be about 28%. We're not going to get to. You think we're going to get to 70% by 2030? I don't think so. So that came from NYSERDA, New York Independent System Operator, all along, and most recently too, in a reliability needs assessment. They said if you take this approach of pursuing wind and solar as your predominant sources, you're going to have reliability problems. You're going to have potential blackouts, and the urgency is approaching us. Tom DiNapoli, the comptroller, he was very critical of the process that the PSC and the state's gone forward with, and there's a whole list of issues of miscalculations, outdated, incorrect data, not fixing data when things have changed, not having a backup plan when this doesn't work, and delays in the building of facilities. This is a quote from him: "The absence of cost estimates makes it difficult, if not possible, to assess its impact on New Yorkers, including those who are currently struggling to pay their utility bills." 1 million New Yorkers or ratepayers are already in arrears. They're not being able to pay their bills. What's going to happen when those bills double? And here's the former PSC commissioner basically again emphasizing that the howl from these constituents will be heard from here to Timbuktu. So there are a lot of concerns that have been raised most recently, and I think the thing that kind of pushed it over the edge was a letter that the Business Council wrote. It was actually a letter jointly signed by the Business Council and a whole slew of labor unions that said this is a path that's going to be this could be economically destructive, and it's time to rethink. So I won't go through all the things they said here, but you can see that they say we need to take a different course. They expressed concerns about intermittency of solar and wind generation, and they said nuclear needs to be part of the picture. They say the focus should be on enabling the greatest cost-effective emission reductions while ensuring New Yorkers, residential, commercial, industrial energy consumers maintain access to safe, reliable, and affordable energy. So Governor Hochul is listening now. I think it's all like I said, hitting the fan, and this is a quote from her: "The costs have gone up so much that she now has to say, what's the cost on typical families? We have to think about collateral damage of these decisions, either mitigate them or rethink them." So that led to very recently this was the summit that occurred on September 5th in Syracuse, and it was something that a lot of us were kind of shocked, but pleased to see an acknowledgement that it's time to rethink where we're going here. And so this is the agenda. And Governor Hochul was there to speak in the beginning of it too. Some of the conversation was how to accelerate wind and solar. I don't think that's the right way to go, but that was part of the conversation. But the interesting thing is when Governor Hochul spoke, she talked about how we need to expand the potential sources, from wind to solar to geothermal to hydrogen to even splitting an atom. Those were her words. These are the possibilities that lie before us. She said she'll move heaven on earth to make sure we have the strongest economy and the strongest energy plan. So that's pretty powerful, I think. I have to give the governor credit for standing up to those other entrenched forces that want to keep us going down a path of failure and actually looking at this a different way. So this was the afternoon session, and you can see that a good portion of it was devoted to nuclear power. And unlike the Climate Action Council that got into these kind of silly discussions and rhetoric about nuclear, you actually had some real substantive conversations going on in the afternoon about what's happening with nuclear power around the world and other states. And there was an announcement of a blueprint for consideration of advanced nuclear here in New York. I find that pretty amazing. So that's the draft blueprint that's now subject to public review. And it's a tight time frame on that. We should comment by October 5th. But so this is movement in the right direction, I think. And I think we have to give the governor credit for having the bravery to look at this. Is there hope for New York? I think there is hope for New York. And one thing I'll leave here, and this will be the last thing I say, just as an example, let's look at what happened in Ontario, what happened in Canada. About 10 years ago, they also embarked on something called the Green Energy Act. It was a lot like the CLCPA. And they had a lot of promotional material about it, about how it was going to meet all of our energy needs with clean electricity from wind and solar, how the prices will come down for electricity. There's a lot of verbiage here. In reality, pretty soon it became apparent that it wasn't working. In fact, they were having to guarantee prices for wind in particular that were 40 times higher than the market rates. It was absolutely absurd. It ended up resulting in so much turmoil. You had a divide between the upstate, or I should say, the upper part of the rural upper part of Ontario versus the southern urban part of Ontario, kind of similar to here in New York. And it ended up causing an overthrow of their political government. Actually, the conservatives came into power, and they basically said that we're going to throw this away. We're going to and they actually said here they're eliminating legislation that introduced disastrous changes to Ontario's energy system that led to rising electricity rates to families and businesses. Okay, by repealing this act, we're going to restore planning decisions to municipalities that were stripped by the previous government, and ensuring local voices have a final say on energy projects in their communities. I think a lot of folks in upstate New York would like this kind of decision making return to them as well. So I don't think we need to overthrow the government here in New York. I think we can do this peacefully. They did it, I'll be honest, they did it peacefully in Canada too. In fact, in Canada, and they did not give up on the climate issue either. Let me just say that. This does not mean they threw away their concerns about climate change and things of that nature. In fact, what they did is they got smarter about it. This is what they're doing instead. At the Darlington reactor site, they're going to be adding small modular reactors. And they recently decided to add three more of them into their plans. So they've wised up. They're still trying to tackle climate change. They're still trying to reduce fossil fuel emissions. They're trying to reduce impacts, but they're smarter about it. And I think we can be smarter about it too. So that's how I'll end here. Is basically what we want here is a solution that doesn't discriminate against viable carbon-free resources. I think wind and solar have a role to play. Hydropower certainly is reliable, has a role to play. But if we're serious about meeting our energy needs, we're going to need nuclear power as well, and we should be embracing that. If we do that, we can give our kids a future. So that's my comments. And I guess the one last thing I'll say is that Nuclear New York is trying to also be part of the solution. We're having a symposium coming up on September 25th. I encourage people to come to it. It's going to be great. We have global leaders in this field coming from all around to talk about the possibilities. So thank you. I know I talked too much.
Sorry, I'm still muted here. There was an enormous amount of material I really appreciate. Are you able to stop screen sharing?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I think it's very useful, particularly the images of just the massive amount of land area that's required for these facilities. While I am not convinced that carbon dioxide causes climate change, I absolutely don't want to destroy the environment. I don't want to have massive amounts of non-biodegradable plastics and fiberglass and things like that scattered all over the landscape. And I think our energy has to become more efficient, because part of what they're not discussing is, you would presume, as we make more discoveries and hopefully become more advanced, then we will consume more energy per capita. And if the population grows, which I think is likely and also a good thing, the point is, you do want to consume smaller and smaller amounts of fuel to produce greater and greater amounts of energy. Otherwise, you're coming to a Malthusian crash by denying that potential. And I think renewables is really a misnomer, because if you look at the amount of material that goes into solar panels, wind turbines, particularly things like aluminum, which require very high temperatures, I don't know that you could actually have a solar and wind powered economy reproduce itself based on only those types of material. I don't think a solar economy could produce millions of solar panels. You're going to need more dense forms of energy to do that. And also, just two things I'll share, and I'd like your comments, because I know you're talking to people all the time, and I think this is the points you're making have to be heard, particularly by younger people who are rightly concerned about the environment, and they've been stampeded through terror to reject nuclear power. But I'm working with some people up in Niagara County who are fighting these massive solar and wind installations, which are owned by foreign companies and the landowners, where they're trying to put these monstrosities, the wind turbines or the solar panels. The farmers, or whoever owns the land, are going to be left holding the bag at the end of the thing. They're getting an initial payment to get, to make their land available, but then the companies are going to walk off and leave them. One report, one of the people told me, who is a farmer herself and knows other farmers, she said that one effect of a neighboring farm putting up a massive solar array is that the farmer across the street had all of his wells run dry. They ran out of water, and I would imagine probably when rain hits these things, it evaporates, or you just don't get the same amount of water coming into the soil. So you're having all kinds of unintended consequences. This morning, a friend of mine who was with the Long Island Fishermen's Association, I asked her if she was familiar with the Nantucket fiasco with that giant thing. And she said fiberglass shards are actually getting as far as Long Island, and sent a picture of a dead whale. I don't know if the whale was killed by that or not. I'm not going to presume to say how the whale died, but these things have a real effect. So I'd just like to get your thoughts in terms of how it's going, and what you think the prospects are.
I agree with you. I think the word renewable is a misnomer, especially as it's been assigned uniquely to the wind and solar, and also biomass. I mean, that's another form of energy that some folks claim is renewable, and it has a massive impact. But so, like the charts that I showed indicated, if you look on all issues, whether it's land or whether it's material content, nuclear is going to have the smallest footprint. And to me, that makes it the greenest form of energy, frankly. And even when it comes to the fuel, and I didn't mention this before, but I should have, is some of the newer reactor designs are could potentially be able to recycle that existing fuel from existing reactors. In fact, they say that that we have already, without having to mine anything else, we already have, in terms of existing um, spent fuel, enough source material to have about 200 years worth of electricity. Another thing that I think you'll strongly support, I'm sure you're aware of it, is at the end of the Cold War, there was an initiative called megatons to megawatts, and that was an initiative that actually allowed for the United States to receive from the former Soviet Union um, uh, 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 supplies of unenriched uranium that had come from nuclear weapons. So actually, you're seeing the drawdown of nuclear weapons, volatile nuclear weapon material, and getting that turned into, unenriched, or I should say, lesser enriched content that could then be used in commercial nuclear power plants. So we're actually making the world safer while also producing electricity for mankind. I think that's the kind of thing we need to do. One of the people who's going to be speaking at this upcoming summit on the 25th is Charles Oppenheimer. He's the grandson of Robert Oppenheimer. And Charles Oppenheimer actually has started a new foundation called the Oppenheimer Project, where he's looking at ways we can bring technology and nuclear specifically into the fold to help benefit humanity. And one of the things he has said is that, look, we've got 12,000 nuclear weapons, pointing all over the place. We have a few hundred nuclear power plants in the world, but we have 12,000 nuclear weapons. Why don't we turn that around? Why don't we just switch that? And I'm all in favor of that. I think it would be a tragedy if the only thing we can decide to do with this tremendous source of energy is to do harm with it, or do the potential for harm with it, when it has so much magnificent opportunities for uplifting humanity, bringing energy to poverty-stricken parts of the world, and meeting the needs of society as a whole.
That's great. I hadn't heard of megatons to megawatts. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
That's
I can share you more information on that.
great, great. I would really love that. One other question I had, because I know there's been so many, are battery storage areas, are they a hazard? It seems, I don't know, how they're designed. Obviously, you have the lithium batteries on people's e-bikes that are causing fires all over the place in the city. But what about putting up these big battery facilities?
Yeah, there have been accidents. In fact, a few months ago, it escapes me the location. I can't think of it at the moment, but in upstate New York, there was a fire at one of the large-scale battery plants associated with one of the solar facilities, I think. And they had to just let it burn out on its own, because it's hard to fight a fire like that. And it's ironic too, because the governor actually issued a shelter-in-place order for that community up there because of the toxic fumes. Now, Indian Point was around for decades, and so here we are. The renewable build out has only started, and we already have a shelter-in-place order from a battery plant that caught on fire. That didn't happen in the whole history of Indian Point, and so it's to me it's rather ironic.
Thank you. That's very important. Well, I think we should wrap up. I really appreciate what you went through. I want to get this video out far and wide. I think it's a very important complement to the peace movement, really, because ultimately you will not have, it's not enough to have an absence of war or to eliminate weapons. People must be out of poverty. You must have stability. You have to have economic development. And here you see a perfect example how you could simply shift from the destructive power of nuclear weapons to energy in a way that's also desperately needed around the planet. So if you have any final words, I just want to make one announcement at the end, but if you want to say anything in closing, please go ahead.
Well, I just thank you for having me on the show. I 100% agree with you on that. If we can shift this paradigm that people have, and I think it is shifting, to fearing nuclear power, to recognizing its tremendous benefits. I think you had some of that with the Eisenhower administration, Atoms for Peace. I think some of that awareness is coming back. So we all need to be part of making that happen.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And again, for people who may not know, this is Keith Schue, and he is an electrical engineer and has been very active in various associations dealing with the environment, energy, et cetera, in the state of New York. The last thing I'd just like to tell everyone is on Sunday, September 11th, the Schiller Institute New York City Chorus will be performing in the Bronx at 5 p.m. a 9/11 memorial concert on the fight for classical culture in America. And this draws on the work of Antonin Dvorak, who was a student of Brahms, who used the European folk songs as a basis for many of his compositions. Dvorak, who was brought here by Jeanette Thurber in Manhattan to create a national conservatory, was overjoyed hearing the music of the African Americans, the spirituals, and the Native American music. And he said, you have everything here to create a great and noble school of classical music. So we will be performing compositions by him and his students like H.T. Burley. It's 5 o'clock at Our Lady of Mount Carmel in the Bronx, and you can visit Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, or SINYC Chorus, sorry, SINYC Chorus.com for tickets. I hope everybody comes to that. It is urgently needed in this extremely difficult political and strategic time that we immerse ourselves in beauty so that we can rise above it and not fall victim to the ugliness around us.